The joke begins. The Grand Assembly Hall aboard the neutral station Polaris, a chord hummed with tension. Delegates from over 50 species sat in their observation chambers, watching through crystalline viewports as the first formal meeting between the Zirelli Empire and humanity commenced. The Zirelli, slender, four-eyed beings with porcelain blue skin and a deep disdain for most other species, had long viewed humans as a quaint novelty at best, a dangerous anomaly at worst. High Chancellor Tyvar of the Zirelli leaned back in his hovering seat, lips curling in a smug smile. Beside him stood his niece, Princess Veela, a minor royal known more for her sharp tongue and disobedience than any diplomatic skill. She was dressed in ceremonial robes, golden cuffs glinting under the lights, but her eyes were half-lidded with boredom. "This will teach the humans to keep their ambitions humble," Tyvar murmured. When a human envoy entered, the atmosphere shifted. Ambassador Nathan Rourke, tall and broad-shouldered with streaks of gray at his temples, walked with the calm confidence of someone who had seen war and walked away with his humanity intact. Behind him followed his staff, polite, composed, quietly observant. Tyvar rose, theatrically extending a hand toward Veela. As a token of goodwill and cultural unity, the Zirelli Empire presents this gift to humanity. Princess Veela, as bride to your ambassador. The chamber erupted into whispers and blinking lights as translators scrambled to interpret the statement. Rourke's brow furrowed just slightly before smoothing out. He stepped forward, offering a tight but respectful nod. "We appreciate the gesture," he said slowly. "Though unexpected, we will treat your princess with all due respect and honor." Veela blinked. That wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. She expected outrage, confusion, maybe an angry outburst. Instead, this human spoke like she was a real diplomat, not part of an elaborate joke. The ceremony proceeded quickly. Signatures exchanged, holographic tokens passed. By galactic law, the marriage was recognized, a footnote in the increasingly strange book of interspecies diplomacy. Hours later, in the private quarters assigned to the human ambassador, Veela sat cross-legged on a couch, sipping something warm and surprisingly pleasant. Rourke stood by the window, watching the stars whirl silently by. "You do realize this was meant to humiliate you," she said bluntly. "The marriage was a joke. I'm your punishment for stepping out of your league." Rourke looked over his shoulder, then smiled faintly. "Yeah, I figured. That caught her off guard. And you accepted anyway?" "I've handled worse than awkward politics," he said. "Besides, I'm not in the habit of rejecting guests, even if they're wrapped in sarcasm." There was a long silence. Veela studied him, noting the calm in his body language, the lack of fear or anger. He wasn't posturing like a soldier or groveling like a sycophant. He was just being. "You're not what I expected," she muttered. "Likewise," he said, pouring 2 more cups of the earth drink, tea, they called it, and handing her one. "But we've got time to adjust expectations." Days passed, then weeks. The plan, as vague as it was, involved Veela observing human culture in preparation for a mock diplomatic report. The Zirelli expected her to return with tales of primitive food, disorganized governance, and emotional outbursts. Instead, Veela found herself intrigued. Earth was noisy, yes, chaotic, even, but there was a strange kind of harmony in the mess. People argued and laughed in the same breath. Art was everywhere, from graffiti walls to symphonies. Children played in dirt and dreamed of stars. Rourke gave her space, but didn't treat her like a burden. He explained customs patiently, introduced her to scientists and school children, to veterans and poets. Once, he even took her flying over the Amazon in a small hovercraft. She had never seen anything so green. One evening, as they watched an old Earth film on a projector, she caught herself laughing, not politely, but genuinely. She glanced at Rourke, who was smiling not at the screen, but at her. That night, lying awake in her guest quarters, Veela whispered aloud to the ceiling, "What if the joke's on them?" Back on Polaris Accord, Chancellor Tyvar received a brief report from his niece. Studying the humans, more primitive than expected in some ways. In others, They're surprisingly adaptive. The ambassador treats me with respect, despite the farce. I will continue observation. This may take longer than projected. He laughed when he read it, oblivious to the subtle shift beneath her words. And so the joke began. But it would not end the way anyone expected. The human factor. The first thing Veela noticed about Earth was the noise. Not just the volume, but the layers. Children shouting, engines humming, bird song, distant music, overlapping voices in a dozen languages. It was like the entire planet refused silence. On Zirelli, silence was sacred. On Earth, silence was suspicious. Nathan Rourke stood beside her on the tarmac as the delegation stepped off the transport. He watched her reaction with a faint smile. Overwhelming, he asked. Chaotic, she replied, eyes scanning the crowded welcome team, journalists waving drones, and civilians cheering behind security barriers. Welcome to home. Veela had expected to be sequestered, isolated for her own safety or for diplomatic show. Instead, Nathan brought her directly to the human diplomatic compound in New Geneva, a gleaming facility of glass and greenery nestled beside old-world architecture. He gave her quarters with a view, access to human databases, and, most disarming of all, a sense of freedom. I don't need a security escort, she asked one morning. You're not a prisoner, he said, unless you're planning to assassinate someone, in which case I may need to revise the hospitality policy. She almost smiled. Over the next several weeks, Veela ventured out more and more, escorted loosely by aides or sometimes Nathan himself. They visited museums, research centers, even an urban garden tower that grew food in vertical coils under artificial sunlight. What surprised her most wasn't the technology, though impressive, but the humanity beneath it all. A physicist wept when describing a dying star. A child in a wheelchair gave her a hand-drawn picture of their two species holding hands. A war veteran with missing limbs taught her how to play chess. One afternoon, as Veela sat with Nathan in a crowded park, watching children play, she said, "You know, this whole marriage was meant to embarrass your people." Nathan sipped his coffee. "Yes, and yet you show me your world like you're proud of it." "I am," he said simply. "We're not perfect. We've made terrible mistakes. But we try. We care. That counts for something." Veela didn't reply. She was still learning what counted on Earth. That night, an explosion shattered the quiet of the diplomatic compound. Security systems kicked in instantly, and Nathan dragged her down behind a blast wall just as a second blast cracked glass in the hallway. Alarms blared, and emergency lights bathed everything in red. By the time the attackers were repelled, a rogue Zirelli faction trying to correct the insult, 3 humans were wounded, 1 critically. Veela stood over the aftermath, trembling, not in fear but fury. "I was the target," she hissed. "They risked your people's lives for a joke they told." Nathan's uniform was torn, blood on his sleeve, not his own. "You're not a joke anymore," he said, "and neither is this alliance." The next day, the media ran with the story. Alien princess saves human ambassador. Interstellar bride foils attack. Cameras followed her everywhere. Children wore paper crowns like hers. Artists painted murals of her and Nathan standing together under Earth's sun. She hated the attention, but loved the message. The Zirelli had meant to mock, but Earth had embraced her. Weeks passed. Her bond with Nathan deepened, not just politically, but personally. They shared late-night conversations about war, loneliness, duty. One evening, after a diplomatic dinner, he walked her to her quarters. Neither spoke for a long moment at the door. Finally, he said, "I know this started as a performance. You owe me nothing." She stepped closer. It stopped being a performance a while ago. Their kiss was quiet, respectful, and irreversible. Later, in the dark of her room, Veela stared out at Earth's moon. She touched her abdomen, a flicker of intuition already blooming beneath her skin. Zirelli biology was advanced. Her people had never tested cross-species compatibility seriously. Why would they? The idea had been absurd. But the joke was over. Something real had begun. Consequences. The transport touched down on Zirelli Prime under a shroud of silence. Princess Veela disembarked alone, cloaked in ceremonial garb that barely hid the subtle swell of her midsection. Her steps were slow but deliberate. No fanfare greeted her this time. No jesting lords. Only the tight-lipped guards of the Zirelli High Spire and the cold, unblinking gaze of Chancellor Tyvar. He stared at her belly first, then at her face. "You're pregnant." Veela didn't flinch. "Yes. With his child." "Our child," she corrected calmly. The council chamber pulsed with restrained chaos. The high castes murmured, expressions unreadable behind their intricate face masks. They hadn't summoned her for punishment yet. They wanted an explanation. A chance, perhaps, to dismiss it all as another Zirelli experiment gone awry. But her report left no ambiguity. The conception was natural, Veela stated, standing before the gathered nobles. There was no artificial aid, no laboratory intervention. "I did not come back broken. I came back changed." The silence was brittle. "This wasn't supposed to mean anything," hissed High Judge Carrix. "It was a prank, diplomatic satire. Now it's become political dynamite. You've conceived with a human," another counselor snapped. "A volatile, emotionally unstable species." Veela raised her voice. "And yet it was a human who sheltered me when you made me a mockery. A human who treated me with dignity, not as a pawn. What does that make us?" Gasps echoed. Tyvar stepped forward, his tone colder than interstellar ice. "This will not stand. The child must be examined. If it poses a threat." "You will not touch my child," Veela said. Her tone wasn't loud, but it cut through the chamber like a blade. "You are Zirelli," Tyvar snapped. "Your womb belongs to our future." "No," she said. "My child is the future." The debate exploded. Some saw a chance to exploit the situation. Biological fusion with humans could mean new genetic advantages. Others saw her child as an abomination, a mutation born of misplaced sentiment. Veela was escorted to a private estate under guard, supposedly for protection. It was a gilded prison. News of her pregnancy leaked, either from a careless aide or a deliberate counselor. Public reaction was swift and polarizing. Protests ignited across Zirelli cities. Some demanded her exile. Others begged to see the hybrid child. A few, curiously, sent messages of support. The younger generation, those fascinated with human culture, began calling her the bridge. Veela recorded a message in secret. "I'm not a fallen princess. I'm not ashamed. I chose humanity, not because they are perfect, but because they feel. They fight not for conquest, but for each other. My child will not be a weapon or a symbol. They will be loved. That is the future I choose." She smuggled it off-world via an old friend in the diplomatic corps. On Earth, the video played in 100 languages. It became viral within hours. Nathan Rourke watched it in stunned silence, then stood and turned to the emergency channel. "Give me the ship. We're going to Zirelli." The diplomatic team tried to protest. Earth had no legal claim. It was an internal matter. Nathan disagreed. "Earth stands for its people, and she's one of ours now." The diplomatic envoy arrived in Zirelli orbit 2 days later, flanked by 2 unarmed cruisers painted with humanitarian colors. Nathan personally stepped into the council chamber, dressed in full ambassadorial regalia, Earth and Interstellar Accord badges gleaming on his chest. Tyvar greeted him with a sneer. "Come to reclaim your prize?" "I've come for my wife," Nathan replied. "And our child. Your internal politics don't override universal law. She's Zirelli. She belongs here. She belongs where she is safe, free, and loved," Nathan said. "We're not here for conquest. We're here for custody." The council buzzed with fury, but the cameras were rolling. The galaxy was watching now. Veela's voice had already captured the hearts of millions. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. Veela was brought into the chamber. When she saw Nathan, she didn't cry. She didn't run. She walked to him, steady and calm, and took his hand. "My choice," she said, looking straight at Tyvar. "Not yours." Nathan smiled, gently resting his other hand on her stomach. "We're going home." The council didn't stop them. They couldn't. The future had already begun. Humanity's response. The Zirelli High Chamber had never been so silent. Nathan Rourke stood beside Veela, his posture straight, voice calm, but the tension in the room was coiled steel. The cameras embedded in the crystalline walls captured every second, broadcasting it live across the Zirelli Empire and to over a dozen interstellar stations. Veela's hand gripped his tightly, her knuckles pale against his darker skin. Her pregnancy was visible now, unmistakable. She didn't try to hide it. High Chancellor Tyvar glared down from his hovering dais. "You defy an empire. I defend a family," Nathan said. "An Earth does not abandon its own." Murmurs stirred through the assembled nobles. For centuries, the Zirelli had considered themselves beyond the mess of emotion that plagued lesser species. Yet here stood one of their own, a royal, choosing affection over allegiance, love over legacy. Tyvar waved his hand, and a hologram sprang to life. Genetic charts, medical scans, predictive simulations. "This child," he said coldly, "is not a symbol of unity. It is a destabilizing variable, a biological wildcard. It is unregistered, unapproved. We cannot allow it to exist outside oversight." Veela stepped forward. "I'm not asking your permission," she said. "I'm telling you, this child will live. Free. You endanger our purity, our traditions." Veela's voice was stronger now. "Then your traditions are too weak to face change." The chamber erupted. Some counselors stood to shout. Others turned to their consoles, rapidly consulting advisors. A few sat frozen, uncertain. But none of it mattered. The child moved. A soft ripple shifted Veela's robes. The motion was subtle, but unmistakable. One of the Zirelli dignitaries gasped. The cameras caught it. The networks played it. And across the Zirelli Empire, millions watching from homes, from city plazas, from orbiting ships, saw the movement. A heartbeat, kicking against centuries of arrogance. Veela placed her hand over her stomach. "This is not a weapon, not a scandal. This is a life, and it belongs to both our worlds." Tyvar stood slowly. "What do you expect, princess? That we simply let you leave, carrying the child of a foreign power?" "I expect you to make the right choice," she said. "Or history will remember that when change came, Zirelli turned its back on its own daughter." Another silence followed, this one longer, heavier. Finally, a voice spoke. Not Tyvar's, but from the council's outer circle. Elder Vashan, one of the oldest and most respected philosophers in the Empire. "The child is not a mistake," he said. "It is a mirror of what we fear, of what we might become." He turned to Tyvar. "And mirrors cannot be shattered without losing ourselves." The Chancellor said nothing. He merely turned and walked out. That was all it took. Within hours, a statement was issued. Princess Veela was granted full diplomatic autonomy. Her child would be recognized as a neutral citizen of both Earth and Zirelli, pending future negotiations. It was a political compromise, delicately worded. But to the galaxy, it meant something far greater. Human and Zirelli DNA had fused, and the result was not chaos. It was possibility. The Starliner Solace Wind cruised through the upper atmosphere of Earth, bound for the Human Alliance Diplomatic Council in Geneva. Veela sat in a reclining seat near the viewport, her eyes fixed on the blue-green curve of the planet below. Nathan joined her, 2 steaming cups of tea in hand. "You sure you're ready for all this?" he asked, setting one beside her. "No," she said, "but I don't need to be ready. I just need to keep going." He sat beside her, placing a gentle hand over hers. "The galaxy's watching," he murmured. "Let them," Veela said, eyes still on the stars. "They thought I was a joke. Now I'm a beginning." She leaned into him, and for the first time in her life, Veela didn't feel like a pawn. She felt like history,